What is going on, y'all? It is the Caveman back at it again with The Cave, episode 2. I have a long list of items that I want to get to today. But first, as always, I'm making it a routine on this podcast. We got to crack open my $6 bottle of a white Zinfandel from Sutter Homes. Hold on, I got to unscrew it. Oh, all right, there we go. And we're going to get the ASMR pour in, something I'm going to make a staple of this podcast. Whether it's $6 or $460, the pour sounds the same. That's right. Whether it's cheap, expensive, it doesn't matter. I'm the one drinking it. I like the wine. If you have any wine recommendations, leave them down in the comments. I want to try some different wines throughout the series. But for now, I'm drinking my Sutter Homes. And before we get into anything football related, I do want to quickly, once again, send my thoughts and prayers to those involved in the Kansas City tragedy. Just enjoying what's supposed to be one of the best days of the year for the city. And senseless violence in this country ruins yet another mass gathering. It's a sad reality that you can't even go out in public without feeling unsafe in this country anymore. And all we can do as citizens is seemingly continue to send our what feel like useless thoughts and prayers, while those with the power to make a change sit on their hands and watch the rinse and repeat cycle over and over, and we have to wonder, when will it stop? But that's something I'm going to table for another day. I did just want to mention, I'm once again sending my thoughts and prayers to those involved. But speaking of the Super Bowl, on a more lighthearted topic, I wanted to talk about some antics that occurred after the game and some conversations that arose from the big game. And one would be the controversy surrounding Kyle Shanahan and his agenda following the Super Bowl. And that was his decision to fire Steve Wilks a couple days after the big game. This is semi-old news, but I wanted to touch on it. This was met with a ton of heat because people felt like Kyle Shanahan was scapegoating Steve Wilks, because if any reasonable person watching that game said that Steve Wilks' defense was the reason why they lost, then they're not reasonable. I mean, I would argue that most people would agree Kyle Shanahan's offense was the side of the ball for San Francisco that didn't pull their weight in the full 60 minutes, and Steve Wilks' side was what did. But Shanahan had to find a way to justify why they lost, and some people thought firing Steve Wilks was his way of justifying that. And at first, when the firing happened and people were saying it was a scapegoat case, I agreed right off the rip, but I did some research, did some digging, and it was purely a boiling point. So I did kind of rectify my thought process, and it was really just the straw that broke the camel's back. This was an ongoing process through Kyle Shanahan's mind, and it was kind of an open book, to be honest with you. And once they lost the game, and for reasons that Kyle Shanahan felt fell on Steve Wilks' shoulders, he decided to pull that trigger. But the different conversation is, did Steve Wilks actually deserve to get fired? He might not have been scapegoated necessarily, but does that mean he deserved to get canned? And I'm going to split this up into kind of like a courtroom type of debate. We have the prosecution being Kyle Shanahan and his reasoning for firing him, and then we have the defense being Steve Wilks and why he shouldn't have gotten fired. So we'll start with the prosecution. In Kyle Shanahan's defense, this was certainly not a unit that was as tough as what we're used to seeing from San Francisco on a year-to-year basis. I mean, it felt like on every single week they were not really the physical team that we're used to seeing them be. To rephrase, I feel like San Francisco is always the physical, tough bully boys that are on the field and playing the way they want to play. They are running the type of, how do I rephrase this? They're playing bully brand of football. That's pretty much what I'm trying to say. They're playing physical. They're hitting hard. They're punching the opposing team in the mouth and winning in the trenches. And that felt like it wasn't always the case this year for that front seven specifically. And we can look back throughout the year and see in week number 5 how they I think the Browns ran for 160 against San Francisco. And then in week 8 or week 9 against the Bengals, they ran for 134 on San Francisco. And then a couple weeks later on in the season, we get to the desert. They're playing Arizona, and the Cardinals run for 234 on the 49ers. So that was eye-opening. And then you get to the postseason, and every single game they played in the playoffs, they gave up an average of 150 yards on the ground. Excuse me. They were getting steamrolled. They were getting bullied. And it was not something you're used to seeing from this team, especially since Kyle Shanahan took over. When he took over in 2017, it's not always been, sunshines and rainbows. It's not always been, a contender every single year. So he's struggled. And even during the seasons that this 49er team has struggled under Shanahan, the run defense has never, ever been as bad as it was this year. And I felt like it was an Achilles heel. Since Shanahan took over in 2017, they had never finished below 17th in EPA per rush allowed on the year. This season, the 49ers defense finished 26th in EPA per rush allowed. So significant drop-off. And when you're playing with one of the best front sevens in the NFL, that certainly is a red flag. Not to mention, as I continued my research, I came to find out that Steve Wilks was a master of calling a great game for the first 3.5 quarters. And then when it came to crunch time, late game management, Steve Wilks struggled. And this was a theme that 49ers fans were pointing out, and some 49ers fans agreed with, in the sense that Kyle Shanahan should have fired him. As I continued to read many different times throughout the year, you're asking yourself, why is this defense out there right now? Why are they playing so soft? Why are they not sending heat? You're just questioning play calls in some of the most important parts of games, and the Super Bowl was another example of that. On the biggest stage, late in overtime, you have Kyle Shanahan going ballistic, walking up and down the sideline like a psych patient, talking. It seems like he's talking to himself as he's bitching out loud because he cannot believe the play call that Steve Wilks had put out there in one of the biggest spots in the game. So he had to call a timeout to have either Wilks change the defense or for him to call his own play. And I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was something that had happened supposedly throughout the year to my knowledge now. I did not realize that before. So those two just weren't on the same page pretty much all of 2023. And I think Kyle Shanahan slowly lost trust in Steve Wilks for that reason. But to Steve Wilks' defense, we'll go to the defense now. Is it fair to say that Shanahan should have lost trust in him? Because ultimately, the 49ers still finished 10th in EPA per play allowed. They were still a top 10 defense despite all of the road bumps. And when you consider the loss in Hufanga on the back end, knowing that they play a decent amount of nickel, I would say that's a win. I mean, D'Amico Ryans had an excellent year in 2022, and a large reason for that was because of Hufanga and how dynamic he is. The kid was an All-Pro last year. Not having that piece for the back half of 2023 was a big loss, but Steve Wilks' unit managed. And I think Kyle Shanahan, that's just one of the many things that he just didn't consider. What I also don't think he considered is the fact that Steve Wilks, unlike his predecessors, is new to this organization. I think Shanahan is so used to just putting his mind on autopilot as far as the defense goes and trusting, the in-house talent to run that side of the ball. So in years past, it was Robert Saleh. And then after that, his apprentice, D'Amico Ryans, steps in to take over. And now this year, after the fantastic season D'Amico Ryans had with this unit in 2022, I think he was just kind of expecting Steve Wilks to continue that into 2023. And those are big shoes to fill, especially being a new face. It's a lot to expect. And like I said, it's not like Steve Wilks did an awful job, did a brutal job. I think he did a pretty fair job at the end of the day. And Shanahan just didn't see it that way, and I think he was blinded by the previous expectations that he held or that were created by those who came before Wilks. And with that being said, why would you not want to give Wilks another year to kind of batten down those hatches and, smooth over some of the wrinkles that you might not have agreed with if you're Kyle Shanahan? And why would you fire somebody at such a late stage in in the hiring process, right? Following the Super Bowl, naturally, a lot of other candidates are already, they've taken their jobs, or a lot of the guys that were out there for the taking are gone now. So you know for a fact that Kyle Shanahan has nobody waiting in the wings to take over for Steve Wilks. So who do you go to now? I mean, Bill Belichick? It has to be Bill Belichick. If you don't go and get Bill, I think this was an absolutely huge mistake on Shanahan's part. That's the only way to justify firing Steve Wilks, in my opinion, is if you go and get Bill Belichick. Are you going to go and get Brandon Staley? Brandon Staley was a dumpster fire that probably couldn't coach a D3 football team right now. So you're going to bring him in to try and fix, I should say, air quotes, your defense? That would blow up in smoke. So, like I said, if you're Kyle Shanahan, I think you need to look at the bigger picture before making an impulsive decision like this and say, you know what, even if I didn't agree with Steve, the year was still solid. They still finished as a top 10 unit. They still were good enough to make the playoffs, make the conference championship, make the Super Bowl, and ultimately were good enough to win the big game. So why not give Wilks another shot to kind of, fix those things, even considering all of the road bumps? I say he had a pretty solid year. So I don't think Steve Wilks should have gotten fired. That was a big mistake on Shanahan's part, in my personal opinion. And I'm interested to see who they choose to replace him with when the time comes. But speaking of some old news, this was about 5 days ago, I want to go back even further, reach deeper in the bag, and talk about an award that was given out. And the reason why I feel like I want to bring this up is because I never officially got my opinion out there on it. And this isn't the comeback player of the year. This isn't the offensive rookie of the year. I want to talk about the defensive player of the year award and how that went to Myles Garrett. I have never seen outrage from a group of people over what was a completely fairly given award than what I saw from T.J. Watt supporters over this this ceremony. I mean, Myles Garrett, let's be real. Myles Garrett and T.J. Watt both had seasons that were more than worthy of winning Defensive Player of the Year. I, for one, think Myles Garrett deserved it. I think they got that award right. But the people that think that T.J. Watt should have won it don't see it that way at all. They're completely irrational about the entire thing. You go look up T.J. Watt, Defensive Player of the Year on Twitter, you see all of these tweets and replies and all of this media of people slandering Myles Garrett, saying he didn't deserve it. Look at all the stats T.J. Watt is better in. How is Myles Garrett even in the realm of T.J. Watt? Blah, blah, blah. This cult, this I'm calling it a cult of T.J. Watt supporters that irrationally refuse to not even just acknowledge that Garrett had a good enough season. It's fine. If they want to disagree with who they gave the award to, fine. But the fact that they can't even simply sit back and acknowledge the fact that Garrett had a good enough season to win it as well is mind-blowing to me. And the funniest part about it all is that, yes, I understand that Watt led or was better than T.J. Watt. Watt was better than Garrett as far as tackles, as interceptions, as sacks. He even had a fumble return touchdown, which is fine, which is cool. But then if you're a Myles Garrett supporter and your rebuttal is how, he had a better pass rush win rate, he had a better disruption rate, he was double teamed more, then all of a sudden those stats don't matter to those TJ Watt supporters. Those go out the window. Their response, their rebuttal to that argument is, those stats are fake bullshit. What even is pass rush win rate? Where was that pass rush win rate in the playoff game? It's just complete ignorance to the truth. That's truthfully what it is. Complete ignorance from that cult of people. So like I said, I have no problem if you believe that TJ Watt should have won it. I think he had a fair argument. But for you to not even acknowledge that Garrett had a good enough season as well, that it was basically a coin flip, you're out of your mind to me. You're an irrational, not a real ball knower. That brings me to my next point. If you're ever talking football with somebody that you're not too familiar with, you're maybe just starting to get to know them, and you want to know if they're a real ball knower or not, this is the test. You ask them, so, do you think T.J. Watt should have won Defensive Player of the Year over Myles Garrett? And you will know right away if they're a real ball knower or not. Because if they're a T.J. Watt cult supporter, they'll say it without even saying it outright. They'll go on the big rant about how, T.J. Watt led Myles Garrett in all of these statistics. He had 19 sacks, led the league. He was obviously better. Garrett's not even close. They'll go on the big rampage about it, and that will be the dead giveaway. Real ball knowers know that Garrett, A, deserved it, and B, at least should have been in the conversation, and that can be acknowledged. If you're a T.J. Watt cult believer, I'm sorry. You are you got some screws loose to be nice about it. But yeah, Myles Garrett absolutely deserved that award. Myles Garrett had a better pass rush win rate and disruption rate than T.J. Watt, and his double team percentage was over double of T.J. Watt. I think T.J. Watt was double teamed like 14% of the time this season. Meanwhile, Myles Garrett was double teamed like 29% of the season. Like, I'm sure if Myles Garrett caught less double teams, he would have gotten closer to that 19 sack mark. But 15 sacks on a 29% double team rate, I will say it's a pretty successful season. The dude single-handedly won football games for Cleveland this year. Single-handedly. How about we look at that Tennessee Titans game? We look at that Indianapolis Colts game. I mean, Myles Garrett was a one-man wrecking crew that T.J. Watt simply wasn't. And I don't know. I feel like that should be common knowledge, but there was a large amount of outrage about the Defensive Player of the Year award from a large, irrational, and honestly, I don't want to say stupid, but tunnel vision, non-open-minded group of people. And that's being nice. That's being nice. All right. Next segment here. Enough with the old news. I have a couple other things that I want to touch on and get my itinerary out here. So let's get into, I'm going to start doing some Q&A. And I have 2 questions here. If you want to ask me some questions for the Q&A, you can join my Discord. I ask 4 questions in my Discord prior to the episode, and you can ask your questions there. Or if you want to ask questions on my Instagram, that is also where I was fielding questions. You can go to my Instagram. Everything is linked in the description on my pages here. You go to my link tree, you can find all my social medias, and you'll be able to ask questions pretty much anywhere, if we're being honest. But I have a couple questions here that I wanted to answer. And the first question comes from ingoldwetrust.ff from my Discord. And this is a fantasy football question. I'm probably not the best guy to get fantasy football advice from, although I will say I finally won a championship this year, and I beat the fucking sorry asses in my league. They know exactly who I'm talking about too, and I will revel in it. I don't care if I don't win for another 5 years. I finally took one home. But anyway, it's a dynasty question too, which I'm not all too, let's say, well-versed in. Anyway, what is Bijan Robinson's dynasty fantasy value, and what kind of trade would it take to get him / move him? This is an interesting question. Being a standard fantasy player, meaning I don't really play a ton of dynasty, I had to do some research on this one. And to me, Bijan is still a top 4 dynasty back, right? I think the top tier is Kyren Williams, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, and James Cook. Especially that knowing that Joe Brady is still the offensive coordinator. That is probably the top tier. And then right below that, I have CMC, Breece Hall. I also have one other guy down there. Breece Hall. Oh, and Jonathan Taylor, that's who. That's right below it. But that's my top tier. I still consider Bijan a top running back, period, for fantasy football, and a top running back for dynasty especially. And with Arthur Smith gone, I think it's safe to assume he's going to be getting the ball more consistently. There won't be irregular antics that are for some reason keeping him off the field. He won't have a random migraine before a random game in Week 7 that holds him out and fucks over so many people. Like, that shit's not going to happen under Raheem Morris. Raheem Morris is a guy that is both an offensive and defensive mind. He's done both. He comes from Los Angeles, where Kyren Williams just saw the ball at a ridiculous rate this season, and he knows that Bijan can replicate that type of success if he sees the volume. So I think it's safe to assume Bijan is going to be getting the rock a lot more consistently. Not to mention, I mean, who is talent-wise, he's still, I mean, he was being touted as the next Saquon Barkley as far as running back prospects go, and all of a sudden that's no longer the case because Arthur Smith used him in a funny way. The guy is still probably the most talented running back in football. You can argue Jahmyr Gibbs. You can, Christian McCaffrey is the best running back. But as far as most talented goes, I think Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs are probably the top two. And that hasn't changed. It's just all about volume with this guy. So if I'm a Bijan owner, I'm not trading him. I do not think selling low is a winning strategy in fantasy football. And this is probably the lowest value Bijan Robinson will ever have in his entire career. It's actually probably been lower throughout the season when Arthur Smith was still the coach. But at this point, it's probably as low as it's going to get. And it's only going to rise from here. So if you have Bijan Robinson, unless you really get the right offer, which I doubt you will, I'm hanging on to him. If I'm trading for him, I think the right price for Bijan Robinson at this point is a minimum of 2 first-round picks. I'm probably looking for a top 3 first and then another first the following year, and maybe like a 5th or another throw-in player. Or maybe if it's not a top 3 pick, you get 2 mid-round first overall first-round picks. But bare minimum, Bijan Robinson should be fielding two firsts, and that's probably still not enough. I do suspect him to get the ball quite a bit this season, and his talent is going to be put on display. So to answer your question in gold, I love Bijan. I'm sticking with Bijan, and if you can trade for him, buy him low, I'm all over that as well. My second Q&A question, this one comes from Lucas on Instagram, and just speaking of Joe Brady, he asks, was Joe Brady the right hire for the Buffalo Bills? So if you weren't aware, Joe Brady, A, is now the offensive coordinator permanently for Buffalo, and B, the Bills did conduct an official hiring process. I think they brought in a few candidates. I think it was Joe Brady's job the whole time. They were just remaining professional about it. But with that being said, I was excited to answer this question because when Brady was made the full-time offensive coordinator, people disagreed with that. I was shocked to see on Twitter, Bills Mafia Twitter, that people were not exactly happy with the decision and that they should be looking elsewhere because they felt like Joe Brady was taking the ball out of Josh Allen's hands and people didn't like the shift in philosophy that we saw from Dorsey to Brady. And I couldn't disagree more, truthfully. I was in love with what Joe Brady did to the Bills offense. I adored his willingness to go against the grain. This team, this Bills offense has been an uber-heavy throwing, passing offense ever since Josh came in the NFL, and it's never been different. So for him to take over as an interim and recognize that Buffalo's strength is on the ground. Our offensive line is a much better run-blocking, power-run type of front than they are in pass protection. They struggle to pass protect consistently. They were a lot better this year, but you're going to get more consistent run blocking from them than you are pass blocking. So Brady recognized that, and as an interim, took over and made that transition, which was bold, and it was for the better. We became a lot closer to the Chiefs offense, which is ultimately the goal. I talked about this in another video on my TikTok about how the year 2023 was the year of the game manager, and it was the year of some of the best offensive minds turning some of the best quarterbacks into the best game managers that they could be. Patrick Mahomes was a prime example of this. He was the ultimate game manager this past season, and Andy Reid has a lot to do with that. His ability to generate yards after catch with the play calling, getting the ball out of Mahomes' hands quick, and then Mahomes just doing the rest. And that was the Chiefs' version of making Mahomes a game manager. The Bills' version, Joe Brady's version of making Josh a game manager, was keeping the ball in his hands but having him run it instead. And I think that's where the misconception really came in. People thought that because Josh wasn't throwing as much, that meant that it was always going to Cook and Ty Johnson and Latavius Murray. When in all reality, Dorsey, when he was the offensive coordinator, gave Josh a combined 411 touches. Touches for a quarterback, in my mind, are a combined dropbacks and rush attempts. In the first 10 weeks, we saw Josh have 411. When Joe Brady took over, from week 11 to the divisional round, he had 396. It just felt like Josh didn't have the ball nearly as much because he was running it a lot more. And that was an element to the Bills' offense that I had been dying for years now. Since Dable left, I have been dying to see Josh use his legs more. I felt like it was the missing puzzle piece for so long. So credit to Joe Brady for recognizing that. But the other thing that he changed was the way that Josh was passing the ball. And this was really where he leaned into the Chiefs type of philosophy. A lot of throws behind the line of scrimmage, short of the line of scrimmage, within 5 yards. The whole idea of generating yards after catch is so important to a successful offense these days, and Joe Brady leaned into that. The Bills are very, very foreign to yards after catch. We don't get a lot. And for Joe Brady to do everything he can to try and generate that exact thing was something I really appreciated. The Chiefs led the league in yards after catch. They've led the league in yards after catch for the last 2 seasons now. And what have they done? They've won back-to-back Super Bowls. So Joe Brady recognized that, and I think instead of just riding the wave of what the Bills' offense typically looks like, and instead of following the grain, he went against it, and he's deciding to almost copy the blueprint of Kansas City, and limiting Josh's opportunities to make mistakes by having him manage the game, by having him do what he does best, and that's keep the ball in his arms, but having him run, which I've been screaming to the rooftops, screaming to the hills for a long time now, but I was very appreciative of the switch in philosophy from Joe Brady. So I'm fully on board with Joe, and I think he absolutely was the right hire for the Buffalo Bills. One last topic before we get to the meat and potatoes of the pod here. We had just a couple hours ago, Matthew Slater announced his retirement. The multiple-time All-Pro special teamer for the Patriots. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because, during the award ceremony, of course, there was the controversy surrounding whether or not Devin Hester deserved to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Of course, he did make it, but it's, people are split down the middle about it. People think that Devin Hester, on one hand, shouldn't get in because he was just a special teamer and didn't impact the game in any other way. And other people think he should get in because he was such a special teamer and he impacted the game like no one else. On that subject matter at least, I think, Devin Hester absolutely deserved to get in. I think Devin Hester paved the way for future special teamers to get in. And, this is kind of off topic, but the Hall of Fame to me is a fucking New York City turnstile. Like, they let a lot of guys in that I feel like shouldn't. And, that's a side conversation. But with that being said, Devin Hester, in what today's Hall of Fame looks like, absolutely deserves to be in there. And the same can be said for Matthew Slater. 2-time All-Pro. I think he's been a Pro Bowler like 11 times now. He has been, hands down, probably the most consistent and the best special teamer for the last decade. And Bill Belichick himself has always given him so much praise as not just a guy and a human being, but of course, as a football player. So I think Matthew Slater, I don't know if this is going to be controversial or not, absolutely deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame alongside Devin Hester. And that makes me think, who's the next Hall of Famer going to be that was primarily a special teamer? I guess we'll come to find out. But I actually lied. I have one other. I can't believe I forgot this segment. How did I forget this? I have one other segment that I want to touch on, and that is what came of the result of the Super Bowl, going back to the Super Bowl again. Another conversation that was sparked, naturally, of course, was the conversation of how close Patrick Mahomes is to Tom Brady. Is Mahomes catching the GOAT? Is he close to being the GOAT? Where does Mahomes stand in terms of the greatest of all time? And not only do I want to touch on that, but I also saw on, I think it was First Take, Stephen A. and Shannon Sharp were having the conversation of whether or not the Mahomes and Brady conversation is the new LeBron and MJ conversation. And with all due respect, I think you kind of got to be a little like fucking schizophrenic to think that those two conversations are even remotely close to each other. Excuse me. And let me tell you why. We are looking at, as far as basketball goes, two guys that have played well into their careers. Obviously, Jordan's done, but LeBron's like fucking 40 years old. The dude's an old man, and he's still playing at a top 5, top 7, NBA player level. In my opinion, he's already the GOAT. Like, LeBron James is already the greatest of all time. I don't know how that's even arguable at this point. But nonetheless, if you don't think he's the greatest, he's at least right on Michael Jordan's coattails. He's right there. He's knocking on the door. So that would mean if the Mahomes and Brady conversation was equivalent, that Mahomes would be knocking on the door of Brady's, GOAT title. And that is so not close. I mean, it's not remotely correct. It's not even the same zip code. I mean, these are not conversations in the same country. And it's purely because it's a time game, right? This is a conversation we're having way too prematurely. Mahomes isn't even inching to 30 yet. Brady won 2 Super Bowls over the age of 40 with 2 different teams. Did I say Mahomes? Brady, I'll probably have to run the film back. Brady won 2 Super Bowls over the age of 40 with 2 different teams. Brady threw for 5,300 yards and 43 touchdowns at the age of 44 years old. Brady did not play a snap in his 21 to 22 years in the NFL when he was mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. Every single snap he took, he had a chance to make it to the Super Bowl. Do you understand how insane that is over a 21-year span? Do you understand how nuts that is? Mahomes has had an excellent start to his career. You compare the first 5 years between Brady and Mahomes, which is what everyone is doing, and yes, Mahomes is not just on pace, he's quite frankly leading Brady throughout the first 5 seasons. But that's just 5 seasons. The reason why Brady is who Brady is not just because he won 7 Super Bowls, but because of how long he was able to sustain such a high level of play. And that's what people are missing in this whole GOAT conversation. The reason why LeBron is so close to MJ, even without having the rings, is because of how long he's been able to play at such a high level. That is what elevates LeBron to Michael Jordan's level, in my personal opinion. The only way Mahomes will be able to get to Brady's level is if he can, withstand the test of father time, which Brady did, which LeBron did. That's what Mahomes is going to have to do. And for people to assume, on top of the fact that he's going to get to 4 to 5 to 6 rings, that's not a guarantee. Winning Super Bowls is hard. I mean, I know it's probably more unlikely than not, but there's a possibility that Mahomes never wins a Super Bowl again. And then what? The GOAT conversation isn't even remotely close. It's where it is today. So, there's so many elements that go into it outside of championship rings, and that's what people sometimes don't really understand about the whole conversation. It's like, to me, obviously winning 7 Super Bowls is the main reason why Brady is the greatest of all time. But in my humble opinion, the other half of it, that's 50%. The other 50% is the fact that he was able to dominate for so long at such a high level at ages of life that no one ever has before. If Mahomes wants to come close to that, he not only needs probably 5 Super Bowl rings, but he needs to be playing, as old as 40, 41, 42, which is possible, but it also has to be good football. So it's just a test of time. The conversation is way too raw to have right now, and he's just still so far off. So, no, the Brady, Mahomes, and LeBron, MJ debate, They are so far apart from each other. It's not even remotely funny. All right. So that brings me to the meat and potatoes of the podcast. I wanted to talk about teams that failed and teams that exceeded expectations in the 2023 NFL season. And I'm not going to go and list off the obvious, like obviously the teams that exceeded expectations, the Detroit Lions, Houston Texans, the Chiefs even, like everyone knows they exceeded expectations. I don't need to point it out. So I'm going to go with a couple other candidates, and that's where we'll start. We'll start with the teams that exceeded. And the team I'm going to go with is the first team I'll start with is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You can't make a list like this without giving credit to Tampa, Baker Mayfield. What a year they had. I had no hope in Tampa. None going into 2023. And why should I have? I mean, to me, Todd Bowles is the uncle at the yearly family gathering that you do not want to talk to. He's grumpy. He doesn't say a word. He's just not fun, uninspiring. He's not someone you want to be around. I mean, I don't know the guy personally, but that's how he strikes me from the outside and from what I've seen in press conferences. So, given the state that the Bucs were left in after Brady departed, I thought they needed some rejuvenation as far as a head coach goes. So that's one thing. The next thing is Brady departed. Brady's gone. They barely scratched the surface of 8-9 with the greatest of all time. Now you're bringing in Baker Mayfield? Like, was I supposed to think that was going to go well? Yeah, he had a fun bedtime story with Sean McVay and the Rams, a couple of seasons ago. But was that enough to think that he was going to be what he was in Tampa? I didn't think so. On top of the fact that what the hell did they do to fix that run game? Nothing. Their run game was pitiful. Bottom of the barrel in 2022. And they didn't do shit to fix it. They lost Leonard Fournette and handed the keys to Rachaad White, who is not particularly the best between the tackles. What is this offense going to be able to produce with? What are they going to do? And then you also have a defense who is, presumably still going to be solid, but not nearly as good as they were a few years back. So it was going to be a rinse and repeat cycle of, this defense trying to fight to keep the offense in games, but not able to quite win them any games, and the offense just going 3 and out, turnover, not being able to score, and they come out with a 5-win, 6-win season at most. But here we are. I'm sitting in this chair feeling like the biggest fucking idiot ever because Baker Mayfield balls out because Dave Canales is a quarterback whisperer, and even though Todd Bowles probably still is that weird-ass uncle at the family gathering that you don't want to talk to, he can still call a fucking great defense who, was excellent. That unit was a masterclass this year. Just a great season from Tampa's defense, which I also didn't see coming. So, I cannot give enough credit to pretty much that entire organization. I mean, Mike Evans had a great year. Baker Mayfield turned it around. Todd Bowles proved me wrong. Dave Canales has, done this twice now. He did it with Carolina. I believe that's where he was previously, and now he's here in Tampa. So, a lot of hope. And there's conversation about whether or not, Baker Mayfield will be who they go with next year. I confidently think they'll give Baker Mayfield, another shot. It's kind of reminding me of a Geno kind of situation with Seattle, except, Baker's kind of 6 years younger than Geno. So, Baker still has the shot to be a franchise quarterback. It's not like he's 35 approaching the tail end of his career. The guy is still young enough to be a franchise quarterback. So I think Tampa would be foolish to move on. Or I guess if they want to go and draft a guy, fine. But I think after what we saw from Baker this year, you give him a semi-consistent run game, I think you will have a relatively solid offense going forward with a relatively young Baker Mayfield. So shout out Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 9-8 record, won the division, not only won a playoff game, but beat the Eagles on their own home. Oh, no, who was home for that game? No, the Eagles were home for that game, right? And then, made it to the divisional round and put up one hell of a fight. So absolutely deserve to make this list. A lot better of a season than I could have ever imagined. But the next team I also want to give credit to, who did not get nearly enough, in my personal opinion, from the mainstream media, would be the Indianapolis Colts. and Shane Steichen. What a job Shane Steichen did. I would say he arguably had the biggest plate of shit to deal with in 2023. It started in the offseason when Jonathan Taylor is boarding Jim Irsay's bus and then getting off and requesting a trade, and then that leaks into the season, and you're running the ball with Zach Moss for half the year. And then just a couple weeks before the season starts, your star slot corner, Isaiah Rodgers, gets cut and banned for gambling, so you lose him. The season starts, your 4th overall pick, Anthony Richardson, goes down 2 weeks in, and you got to turn to Gardner Minshew. I mean, things went from, hopeful when Steichen got hired to shit when, as the season started. And then, 11 weeks in, a couple of Colts players get suspended by the team for who knows what reason. The actual reason I don't think ever came out, but there was a rumor that those guys were shooting at bald eagles or something. It's like he was just dealing with shit after shit after shit. And the team still, from the very beginning, with Gardner Minshew and Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman, I mean, this is not the greatest cast, was competing week in and week out. They would be in the playoff race the entire way through, just barely miss out. I mean, it was a year that deserved a tip of the cap from the first-year head coach, and I feel like we have not, as a collective community, given Shane Steichen nearly as much credit as he deserves for what was, quite honestly, a recipe for disaster. I mean, there's not a lot of guys that could have stepped in and had all of these things snowball on top of him and still be able to walk away a game above 500. So credit to Shane Steichen. Credit to Shane Steichen for sure. And on that note, I want to talk about his former coworker in John Gannon. That's the other team, I think, exceeded expectations this year. And this might sound kind of hypocritical or contradictory. Like, how can I sit here and say the Cardinals exceeded expectations when they, finished with 4 wins, which is probably a record that everyone expected? Well, let me cook. So, this is a group of guys that is not the most talented, right? You start off the year, the defense is pretty skeleton-like. The offense, you got, Marquise Brown and James Conner, I don't even think started off early in the year. I think he was hurt. Josh Dobbs, that's where the Pastronauts started. But they still fought, right? The first 2 games of the year, they lose by a combined 7 points, I believe it was. And then week 3, the Pastronaut on their own home field beats up the Cowboys, who were one of the hottest teams in the league at that point. They had just blown out the Giants by 60, and then the fucking Cardinals beat them. I mean, that was a huge upset. And then we get further into the season, and eventually the Pastronaut takes off to another galaxy, and Kyler Murray comes back. His first game back, they win. I think they beat the Falcons. A couple weeks later, they beat the Steelers. All of a sudden, the Cardinals are competing. I mean, to be fair, they were competing all the way up until that point most of the time. But now with Kyler back, they were really no longer a team that you can just kind of cross off your schedule and say, we'll look to the next week. You always were going to get a fight with these guys. So they win 2 of 4 with Kyler back, and then they go into the bye week and something clicked. I don't know what clicked with Arizona, but they recognized that, hey, we can run the ball over fucking anybody. Anybody standing in our way, we're going to shove it down your fucking throat. And that's what they did. It was stunning. Like I mentioned earlier, they ran for 234 against the Niners. They lost, but it was close. And they really punched San Francisco in the mouth, 234. And then a couple weeks later, they go and they host Philadelphia. This was the game that really exposed Philadelphia for the frauds they truly were. They run for 221 on the Eagles. We're talking about two of some of the best defenses, front sevens in football. And they rush for over a combined 450 on both of them. And they beat the Eagles. And then week 18, I believe it was, they go to Seattle. They unfortunately lose by a point. But they still run for 200 plus. I don't remember the exact number. 3 out of the 4 final weeks, They rushed for over 200 yards as a team each. That is a resilient, a tough, a physical football team that nobody wants to go up against regardless of the win-loss record. Nobody wants to play against a team that can control the line of scrimmage like that. And that's exactly what Arizona did. So, John Gannon, that group, excellent season. I don't care what their win-loss was. That does not indicate the amount of fight and how much they competed on really a week-to-week basis. So, that team is absolutely trending in the right direction as far as I'm concerned. So both Shane Steichen and John Gannon, they left the Eagles to rot, and now they're taking off. They're taking off on their own ships with their respective franchises. So tip of the cap to both of them. All right, so we'll talk quickly about the teams that now failed expectations for the 2023 season. And I have 4 teams here. One is kind of an honorable mention, like a half honorable mention, and I'll explain why. That would be the Philadelphia Eagles. They absolutely failed expectations this year. The only reason why I say it's like 50% is because they did start off the season strong. They got to 11 wins. So, they weren't complete frauds. They started off well. They just kind of had the biggest collapse I've really ever seen in American sports. But nonetheless, what didn't make sense to me was the abomination that was the coaching staff, right? So you go into 2023 and you ask yourself, what is different for Philadelphia? They brought back everybody. The roster is basically the same. You're coming off of a Super Bowl run that you arguably should have come out on top in. And now, who's in your way? This NFC conference is weak as shit. This conference is standing on wooden legs, and they're about to break. Who's in your way? You got the Cowboys. We fucking know how shit goes for the Cowboys every year. The story, it's told the same every single season. And then you got the Niners, who, of course, you expect to have to go through anyway. Otherwise, who else is in your way? What's this landscape got to offer? Nothing. It's for the taking. So, for Philadelphia to, start the year, start off strong, and then, they start to get to about the halfway point, and things start to get semi-shaky. And Brian Johnson and his high school offense starts to get figured out. And all of a sudden, the defense isn't playing nearly as well as we were used to seeing them. And Nick Sirianni decides that, hey, I know Sean Desai isn't doing great right now, so let's give the keys to quite possibly the biggest football... Do I use that word? I'm going to use that word. Let's give the keys to the biggest football terrorist that's still somehow employed in the NFL. Matt Patricia, that's the man that's going to fix this defense. I mean, the Eagles took everything into account. The only thing they didn't expect was to be sabotaged by their own fucking coaching staff. When I tell you Brian Johnson probably couldn't even call plays for my fucking 7-on-7 bar league football team, I mean it. When I tell you Matt Patricia probably deserves to be on some specialized bomb squad for the amount of teams he has just completely dug a hole for, I mean it. And somehow Nick Sirianni did nothing about any of it. I mean, how did he look at that defense and say, Sean Desai, you're the problem, I want Matt Patricia to take over, and then in collective with that, didn't even take a peek at the offense. The offense was the bigger issue, in my opinion. The offense was atrocious. The offense was so brutal. Devontae Smith, Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown. You have the best offensive line in football. You're supposed to be able to run the ball down anybody's throat, and none of those things were happening. And he didn't look at the offense once. He let Brian Johnson do his thing all year long, when I think that's where the change really should have happened. But instead, he turns his head the wrong way. And Sean Desai, you're relieved of your duties for this clown. I don't think Nick Sirianni, this is a guy that I've always questioned what he really did. I've had the thought in the back of my mind during the Super Bowl run. I was like, what does Nick Sirianni really do? Like, could anyone actually answer that question for me? And in 2023, the only thing he really did was assist in sabotaging his own football team. So I don't think it's not very common for a guy to be, outside of my top 10 head coaches while having one of the best teams, at least on paper, in the NFL. Like, that's hard to do, but Nick Sirianni has managed to accomplish it. And I don't know about you guys, but I wanted to mention this earlier. I kind of was getting vibes halfway through the season from Philadelphia that were telling me that they were giving me a 2022 Vikings type of feel, right? You remember the horseshoe that the Vikings had shoved up their ass in 2022? I kind of felt like the Eagles were getting some of that type of luck halfway through the season. They just barely got away from Buffalo, just barely got away with beating Kansas City. And I'm like, they really are catching some massive breaks here. But at the same time, they're still the Eagles. They made the Super Bowl. They have one of the best rosters in the NFL. Like, this isn't the Vikings. So I'm not going to think that this cataclysmic collapse is going to happen. Well, it turns out, just like the sorry-ass Vikings who lost to the fucking Giants in the wild card, the Eagles host the Buccaneers. And, no, the Eagles didn't host the Buccaneers, did they? I got that wrong earlier. The Eagles go to Tampa and get their fucking ass kicked the same way that Minnesota did in the wild card. So, turns out that they were pretty much a carbon copy of each other, and I don't feel bad. I came to strongly dislike Philadelphia this year, and a large part of that because of the whole Big Dom situation. Like, who the fuck is Big Dom? Like, that was the biggest scam of all time. Why is there a random, fucking security consultant on the sideline? For who? For what? The fucking players? Like, why is he there? Why is he getting involved with Dre Greenlaw? I was so glad that guy got outlawed from the sideline. I did not understand why he was down there. I did not understand why he thought he was in the right to get into some scuffle because he was the head of security for the fucking small Philadelphia Eagles. Like, what the hell was that whole situation? I'm glad he got outlawed from the sideline because that whole Big Dom situation really fucking pissed me off. And I also don't like Nick Sirianni. I don't like Nick Sirianni at all. And he's from where I'm from. He's from Jamestown, just a few hours away from where I am. And of course, I fucking can't stand the guy. So don't get me worked up. I became a massive Philadelphia Eagles hater in 2023. Next, though, I want to give credit to the failure of the Carolina Panthers. Oh, man. Now, this team I'm not going to be nearly as harsh with. I feel bad for the Carolina Panthers. There was so much hope for them going into this season. You get the first overall pick. You get your franchise quarterback. You hire Frank Reich. You signed a bunch of veteran talent around your rookie quarterback to prop him up. And, it turns out that you also, not only do you sign that veteran talent, but you also draft Jonathan Mingo in the second round, who was catching A.J. Brown comps because he was big, a big, strong receiver that went to Ole Miss. And it turns out that Frank Reich was cooking as well as SpongeBob was when he forgot how to make a Krabby Patty. It turns out that the veterans that they signed to prop up Bryce Young included a very overrated running back that was nowhere near as good as what the money that they gave him indicated, and two relatively old, washed receivers that could not get any sort of consistent separation at all. Oh, and by the way, Jonathan Mingo is not fucking A.J. Brown. So Bryce Young was standing behind the offensive line made of fucking paper clips and fucking, glue, and getting steamrolled while nobody can get separation. Miles Sanders is sitting his ass on the bench as he got fucking benched for Chubba Hubbard. That the failure of Carolina's front office for this poor kid is, cataclysmic. It cannot be overlooked. And it really does make me think, what if CJ Stroud was put in Bryce Young's situation? And it's, I feel like I'm usually pretty good at, doing those type of hypotheticals in my head where I could say, well, what if this guy played here instead of there? But, in this situation, I cannot picture how CJ Stroud would have managed, because I think the kid is a tremendous talent. I've always thought he was better than Bryce Young to begin with. But how does anybody survive in that barren wasteland of an offense? I don't know. But nonetheless, the Carolina Panthers, they had a disaster of a season, and that no one saw coming. I mean, I saw record predictions that had them at 7, 8, 9. Even some had 10 wins. I did not see a single record prediction of having them under 7. I had them at 6, and I felt like a fucking hater. I felt like the asshole for having Carolina at 6 wins. And it turns out I wasn't a big enough of a hater. I still wasn't. And they finished with 2 wins, and they don't even have anything to show for it because they traded their first overall pick to the Chicago Bears, and now they don't have anything going into this year's draft. So 2023 was basically the biggest waste of time for a franchise in all of American sports for the poor Carolina Panthers. I feel bad for those fans. But I guess on the bright side, they do at least have the Hornets. Oh, sorry. I had to do it. At least guys have the Hornets. You know, they have more wins than the Panthers finished with. Oh, my Lord. Sorry. I had to do that. I'm going to take a drink after that one. Sorry, guys. That was mean. All right. So, Eagles and Panthers absolutely failed expectations. But they weren't the only ones. I still have 2 other candidates that I have to ream a new one. This next one is the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots, what an interesting life form of a franchise this was. I laughed at them after 2022, and I did not think anything was going to really change with this franchise. I thought they had a very Bill Belichick-esque offseason. They signed Mike Gesicki. They let Jacoby Myers walk for Juju Smith-Schuster. They really didn't grab any other offensive talent to help out Mac Jones. It just wasn't an offseason that really moved the needle to any capacity. So why did I expect the season to go any better? Well, that was my former thought process. But when I went to do my record predictions and I started to do some research and, let the input of people that are smarter than me influence my decision making, I came to the conclusion that, wait, maybe the Patriots actually will be respectable this year because they hired Bill O'Brien to fix the offense, right? So hopefully Mac Jones can turn it around. They stole Christian Gonzalez in the first round of this past draft class, so Bill Belichick's going to turn him into an all-pro. And on top of the fact that 2022 was already a disaster in itself. Like, it's hard to get worse than 2022 because Matt Patricia was over there completely, home wrecking that entire offense. So it can't go down from there. And yet they still finished 8-9. Despite all of the speed bumps, they finished 8-9. So it can only go up. So that means they have to be competitive given the adjustments they made in 2023, right? Well, no. Bill Belichick's pursuit of Don Shula's record did not really progress in 2023. 4 wins, I believe. It turns out letting Jacoby Myers walk for Juju was a massive mistake. There was a headline like halfway through the season that quite literally said Juju's knee can explode at any point. We're like, what the fuck? What is this fucking report? Juju's knee can explode? Like, this is the guy you signed and let stay here and while you watch Jacoby walk away? Wow. I mean, there's really not much else to say about this. Most people pin this team at an 8-9 win record in 2023. I did not see anybody predict them to have 4 wins. And, it turns out I guess I should have stuck with my gut because they sucked some pretty big asshole. And now Bill Belichick is unemployed. So, yeah, what a wreck that was. But that leaves me with one more team that I think is the biggest surprise on this list, or at least would have been the biggest surprise had this been a list I made prior to 2023. And that would be the Jacksonville Jaguars. Talk about a season where a team fell flat on their face. I don't think anyone fell harder than Jacksonville. Even Philadelphia. Philadelphia fell hard. They were at the top and they hit rock bottom as well. But the reason why I feel like Jacksonville was worse is because of the amount of hype that they were getting in the preseason, right? Trevor Lawrence, I'm not sure how to gauge Trevor Lawrence as a quarterback, but I'll tell you one thing. He is not the Prince Charming, and he's not been the top 3 quarterback that people were projecting him to be so far in his career. And there's no longer the Urban Meyer excuse. There's no longer the he's still a kid excuse. Trevor Lawrence has not looked great, nearly as good as a lot of people thought he would be. And it doesn't help that his supporting cast was tremendously underwhelming. I mean, we all thought that Calvin Ridley was going to be the guy that is the number 1 receiver that helps Trevor Lawrence ascend to, top shelf quarterback status. But it turns out that a year off of football really does something to a man. And I had that in the back of my mind the whole fucking offseason. Calvin Ridley caught so much hype that guy got. For what? Because he ran around a couple of fucking cones during some offseason drills faster than Zay fucking Jones? That's why he got all this hype? I remember seeing those videos. Look at the speed difference in Calvin Ridley's footwork to Zay Jones. You better draft him early in your fantasy drafts. And I'm sitting here watching these videos like, why are we acting like this guy's going to go for 1,614 touchdowns when he just had a year off? And what does my dumbass do? I completely get away from that thought process, and I draft Calvin Ridley in the 3rd round of fantasy drafts like a fucking idiot. I don't know why I didn't listen to myself again. I find myself to have better takes originally, but then I go and veer away from them. But nevertheless, the offensive supporting cast sucked. Trevor Lawrence was nowhere near as good as we all thought he was going to be. They made that playoff run last year, and they gave the Chiefs a hard time. We thought they were going to make their stamp on the AFC, and Doug Peterson was the man to fix this team. And now we're going into 2024, and we're asking, what kind of quarterback is Trevor Lawrence? And is Doug Peterson going to have a job if things continue the way they're going right now? They have Josh Allen. They have a solid defense, but it still wasn't as good as, maybe a few years back when Jacksonville had that Jalen Ramsey dominant defense, which a lot of people thought they could get back to with Tyson Campbell in the secondary and Josh Allen up front. That's kind of where we all thought this team was going, back to those dominant days 5 years ago. And it was the complete opposite. They were supposed to run away with the AFC South. I mean, completely run away with it. And the Texans win it. The Jaguars scratch and claw their way to 9-8. They were fortunate to be 9-8, if I'm being genuinely honest. And that was it. Now there's far more questions about their future than there are answers. So, yeah, disaster of a season for these 4 teams. But that will probably wrap up the episode. I really don't have anything else listed here on my little itinerary here, so that will do it. If you enjoyed, as always, drop a like, subscribe, follow me on Spotify if you're listening to the audio version, and as always, feel free to let me know some wine recommendations as well on social media or down in the comments. Follow me everywhere you can. My link tree is in the description, and I appreciate you guys for watching, for listening. As always, I'll see you in the cave, episode 3. Cheers.